Hello, I'm David Venny, and this is my very comfortable ladies dance shoe design Eve that I sell in black and in stone from my website, Vidadance.com. Because I've been asked a few times now whether it's possible to dye the stone leather, I've done some experimentation and found a nice burgundy red colour that works really well, and in this video I'm going to show you how I did it. I can't make any guarantees, but I can give some tips on what I found was important to get a good result. The dye I used is number 11 Bordeaux from Tarrago, which comes in a kit containing a bottle of preparation fluid, a bottle of dye, a small brush and a small pad. You'll also need a kitchen scourer. I cut up a new plastic one that's not abrasive, and I used some painter's tape, a fine paintbrush, some old plastic pots, rubber gloves, paper towels and rag. I also used my Dremel rotary tool to speed things up a bit, and I'll show you later how I did that. To get started, I took out the laces and footbeds and used strips of painter's tape to cover up the heel piece and sole like this. It keeps them clean and avoids transferring any brown colour onto the shoe from the edge of the sole. Here's a close-up of what that looks like when it's done. Then before you start to dye the shoes, it's really important to prepare the leather properly to remove all the previous finish. If you don't do that, the dye sits on top of the leather instead of penetrating it, and you end up with blotchy areas. The preparation is key to a good result, and I spent several hours on it. You pour some preparation fluid into a plastic pot, dip your scourer into it, and then start rubbing the leather in circles like this. As you do it, the liquid foams up like you can see in the close-up, and you just keep going and going and going, working right around the shoes until all the leather looks quite dull and lifeless. Then it's best to leave the shoes overnight to dry before coming back to check them. Any areas you can see that still look at all shiny aren't going to accept the dye well. I went over them another time with the scourer and preparation fluid, and places where the fluid soaks in easily are okay, but if it just sits on the surface like you can see in this close-up, that's likely to be a problem area. So that's when I used the Dremel to make sure I've got all the finish off completely. The attachment I used isn't abrasive, as I didn't want to damage the leather, but it did make the job easier. Remember that when the shoes are dry again, it's important to clean off any dust. Otherwise you might get some white spots if it comes off after the shoes are dyed. When you come to start the dyeing, you need to mix the dye thoroughly, and then the first thing to do is to use a small brush to completely cover all the places that are hard to get into with a sponge. I used a fine paintbrush to go over all the stitching, around the edge of the sole and heel, and over all the edges to the leather. Then I added some more painter's tape under the eyelets to keep the linings clean, and after that the shoe looked like this, ready to add the first full coat of dye. The instructions in the kit say to use the brush to transfer a small amount of dye onto the sponge, but I found it easier just to pour some into a small bottle top and pick up a small drop with the sponge each time. You rub the dye on in circles and dab it with the sponge to even the colour out. The aim is to do it in stages and build the colour up by adding a thin coat of dye evenly each time, letting it dry between coats. So this is how it looked after one coat, and after 2 coats, and after 3 coats. After that I took off the painter's tape and used the paintbrush to do any touching up needed. When they're completely dry the dye doesn't rub off, but I sprayed the shoes with some leather protector spray anyway to play safe and to protect the finish. And this is the final result, which looks pretty good. You can find lots more information and order my dance shoes for men and women online at www.vidadance.com.